"Pick up your things and leave," my father-in-law growled, tossing my coat across the Christmas dinner table. Crystal glasses toppled as everyone watched in silence. "People like you will never belong in this family." Not one person spoke up for me, not even my husband. 6 weeks later, when my private jet landed on their struggling vineyard's airstrip, I wasn't there for reconciliation. I was there for the business meeting where they'd learn who had just purchased their mounting debt. The look on Richard Montgomery's face when I walked into that room? Absolutely priceless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, they call me the successful one. The antique grandfather clock in the corner of the Montgomery family dining room struck 8 p.m. Just as Richard Montgomery rose from his seat, his napkin clutched in a white-knuckled fist. The Christmas turkey lay half-carved on the silver serving. Platter, the family's ancestral gravy boat, still steaming as everyone's attention shifted to my father-in-law's sudden movement. The conversation about summer vacation plans at their vineyard estate abruptly died. Even the instrumental Christmas music playing softly in the background seemed to fade away, as if the very air was holding its breath. "I think it's time you left, Sophia," he announced, his voice carrying that unique blend of aristocratic coldness and simmering rage that had intimidated me from the day my husband James had first introduced us 3 years ago. "This is a family dinner, and honestly, I'm not convinced you qualify anymore." The massive oak table fell silent. 14 pairs of eyes darted between us, the prestigious Montgomery wine family and me, the outsider who had dared to marry their eldest son. James stared down at his plate, golden brown hair falling forward to hide his eyes, refusing to meet my gaze. The elaborate Christmas tree behind him, dripping with generations of family ornaments, suddenly felt like it belonged in another universe, one where I had foolishly thought I might someday belong. I felt the blood drain from my face as the weight of 3 years trying to please this family crashed down around me. 3 years of perfect manners, appropriate designer dresses, and swallowed opinions. 3 years of learning about wine regions and pretending to care about sailing regattas. 3 years wasted. "Dad," James finally mumbled, but offered nothing more substantive. No defense, no objection. I glanced at the Christmas tree adorned with ornaments I'd given the family over the years. The hand-embroidered stockings hanging from the limestone fireplace that I'd commissioned from artisans in my home country. The traditional dessert recipe I'd shared with their chef. All these pieces of myself I'd woven into their family traditions, now apparently worthless. "I don't understand," I said, though the truth was beginning to dawn with painful clarity. "What's happening here?" Richard's smile tightened as he retrieved my camel hair coat from the closet, returning to toss it unceremoniously across the table. It knocked over James's wine glass, sending Cabernet spreading across the crisp white tablecloth like a bloodstain. "What's happening is that my son has finally told us about your arrangement," he said, glancing at his wife Victoria, who nodded with pursed lips. "About how you've been controlling everything, making him account for every penny while you build your little secret empire." I looked at James in disbelief. After 3 years of marriage, after everything we'd built together, he'd rewritten our story to paint me as the villain. To his family, no less. The family I'd bent over backward to please. "James, that's not—" I began. But Richard cut me off. "He showed us everything, dear. How you've structured your finances. Very clever. But he's a Montgomery, and Montgomerys take care of their own. We've advised him to speak with our attorney. Harrison is the best divorce lawyer in Boston." The rest of the family shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one contradicted him. Not Victoria, who had once confided. She was glad James had found someone with such a good head on her shoulders. Not his sister Eleanor, whose fertility treatments I had privately helped arrange. Not even his cousin William, who had come to me just last year for advice on his struggling restaurant business. I stood on shaking legs, suddenly aware of how alone I truly was in this room full of people who had claimed to be my family. 3 Christmases, 3 birthdays, 3 anniversaries, all seemingly erased in this single moment of betrayal. "And James?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Is this what you want?" He finally looked up, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't anger or conviction, but something worse: weakness. "I just think we need some space, Soph," he said, the childhood nickname now sounding hollow. "You've been different lately with all the business travel and meetings. Dad's right. I feel like I'm just arm candy in my own marriage." The business travel. Of course. 6 months ago, I'd finally launched my tech platform connecting international artisans to luxury markets after years of quiet development while supporting James's lackluster attempts to modernize his family's wine business. The launch that had taken me to Paris, Tokyo, and Dubai. The business that had finally begun to out-earn the trust fund that had sustained James his entire life. I slipped my coat on with as much dignity as I could muster, aware of every eye on me, every judgment being made. As I reached for my handbag, Victoria spoke. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You can leave the gifts you brought, of course," she said with artificial kindness. "We're not monsters." The stack of carefully wrapped presents under the tree. Hours spent selecting just the right things for each family member. The first edition book for Richard's collection. The vintage brooch I'd found for Victoria. The rare wine I'd imported for James's brother Thomas. "Keep them," I said quietly. "Consider them parting gifts." As I walked toward the door, Richard's voice followed me like a predator. "We're not surprised, you know. The family always said a girl from your background would never truly understand how families like ours operate. My background, the small village in southern Spain that they loved to exoticize in conversation, but clearly considered beneath them. The family olive grove that had nearly failed until my innovation had saved it. The scholarship that had taken me to Harvard Business School, where I'd met James at a charity event. The years of careful planning, saving, and strategic business development that had built the life I now led. A life that clearly threatened the Montgomery family order. I paused at the door, one hand on the ornate brass knob. "You're right about one thing, Richard. I never did understand how families like yours work. I thought they were built on love and mutual respect. Clearly, I was mistaken." The cold December air hit me like a physical blow as I stepped onto the wide porch of their Beacon Hill home. Christmas lights twinkled along the roofline of their historic Boston mansion, the home they were so proud of, featured in architectural magazines and on last year's historical home tour. The home they didn't actually own outright, though none of them knew that particular detail. Not even James knew everything. He'd been happy to let me handle the boring financial stuff, as he called it. Happy to enjoy the benefits of my financial acumen without understanding the structures I'd created. Structures that were about to become very, very relevant. Because what Richard Montgomery didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 3 years ago, when the family vineyard had faced catastrophic crop failure after an unexpected frost, I had been the one to save them from financial ruin. I'd created an investment vehicle that purchased their debt from the bank, restructuring the terms to something they could manage. I'd done it anonymously through one of my investment companies, telling James only that I'd found a solution through my business school network. Richard had accepted the miracle without question, too relieved to maintain appearances to look too closely at their savior. He'd even thanked me for whatever strings you pulled with those international banking friends of yours to help them keep the vineyard. The irony would have been amusing if I wasn't sitting in my car sobbing on Christmas night, marriage imploding, family lost, entirely alone except for the knowledge that I wasn't quite as powerless as they believed. I drove through Boston's historic Back Bay in a daze, passing by the holiday decorations and families visible through warm-lit windows. Families nothing like the one I'd just left. I ended up parking along the Charles River, where James and I had walked on our first date, the water dark and still beneath the winter sky. My phone buzzed repeatedly with notifications. The family group chat I was still part of lit up with messages. Eleanor. That was awkward but honestly overdue. She never really fit in. Thomas. Remember Thanksgiving when she tried to explain blockchain to Dad? So cringe. Victoria. I'm just glad James finally saw reason. We'll find him a proper match next time. And then, most painfully, James himself. Thanks for understanding, everyone. It's been hard, but Dad helped me see the situation clearly. Staying at the house tonight could use the support. The house. Their house. The house whose mortgage was now technically owned by Artisan Ventures International. My company. I shut off my phone and stared out at the water, the familiar outline of MIT visible across the river where I'd earned my second graduate degree. 3 years of my life had just shattered, but as the shock began to fade, something else took its place. A cold clarity I'd never experienced before. The business strategist in me, the one who'd climbed from a struggling Spanish olive grove to the C-suite through discipline and calculation, began to assess the situation with surprising detachment. James wanted a divorce? Fine. Richard thought I was controlling the finances? He had absolutely no idea. I reached into my purse for my emergency pack of tissues, but my fingers found something else, the small velvet box containing the gift I'd planned to give James privately later that night. Inside was the deed to a small vacation cottage in the Spanish countryside near my family's groves. I'd finally saved enough to buy it outright, planning to tell him we could build the Mediterranean retreat he'd always talked about. I snapped the box shut and tossed it onto the passenger seat. That dream was dead now, but others would take its place. By the time the sun rose on December 26th, I had stopped crying. I checked into the Four Seasons Boston, ordered room service, and opened my laptop. By morning, I'd outlined a comprehensive strategy for what came next. Not just survival, I was well beyond mere survival at this point in my life, but a complete recalibration of my existence. The woman who checked into that hotel on Christmas night was a people-pleaser who'd spent 3 years trying to earn the approval of a family that would never truly accept her Mediterranean heritage and self-made success. The woman who checked out the next morning was someone else entirely. The first call I made was to Carter Jenkins, the attorney who had structured all my business investments and private acquisitions. Not because I wanted to beat the Montgomerys to legal representation, but because Carter had been my personal attorney. For years, handling all my business matters and private investments, Richard had no idea that his recommended lawyer, Harrison, was actually Carter's former partner and would never take a case against me due to their continuing professional relationship. Sophia, Carter answered, sounding surprised. Merry Christmas. Is everything all right? Not exactly, I replied, sliding into the driver's seat of my car. I need you to block off some time today. There are some matters we need to discuss regarding the Montgomery vineyard debt and my marriage. There was a pause on the line. Ah, he said finally, understanding immediately. Carter was nothing if not quick. I see. I'll clear my afternoon, and Sophia. I'm sorry. Don't be, I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. This was always going to happen eventually. I just didn't see it clearly until now. As I navigated morning traffic toward my office downtown, I realized something that made me laugh out loud in the car. A slightly unhinged sound that startled even me. For all Richard's condescension about my background, he'd never bothered to understand what that background had actually given me. An education in anticipating crises, in identifying threats before they materialized, in never leaving myself vulnerable. He thought coming from old Boston money meant he was smarter, more strategic, But growing up watching my family nearly lose everything had taught me never to take financial security for granted. And that was a lesson the Montgomerys were about to learn the hard way. Their perfect Christmas dinner had ended with them throwing me out into the cold, believing they held all the power. They had no idea that in 6 weeks, when the vineyard's major loan payment came due, a payment they'd struggled to make without my quiet subsidies, they would discover exactly who held the real power in this situation. And I would be ready. My phone rang again. James this time, not the group chat. I connected it to the car's Bluetooth. "Soph," he started, his voice carrying that placating tone he used when he thought I was being emotional. "I think we need to talk about last night. Dad was out of line with how he handled things. But you have to admit there's some truth to what he said. You've changed since the business launched. It's like I don't even know you anymore." I pulled up to a stoplight and watched a young couple crossing the street, holding hands and laughing in new Christmas scarves. "You're right," I said calmly. "I'm not the same person you married. That person thought she needed to make herself smaller to fit into your family. That person is gone. See, this is exactly what I'm talking about," he sighed. "Everything has to be a confrontation with you now. There was a time when you would have tried to understand my perspective." The light turned green. I pressed the accelerator. "And there was a time when you would have defended me to your family," I replied. "Listen carefully, James. I'll have Carter draw up preliminary divorce papers. You can stay at your parents' house for now. We both know you can't afford the apartment on your trust fund disbursements without my contribution. But understand this. I built a business from nothing while you were still trying to figure out how to digitize your family's wine inventory. I put myself through 2 graduate degrees. I worked my way from intern to CEO through sheer determination. If you and your family think I'm going to roll over and let you rewrite our story to make me the villain, you have severely underestimated what I'm capable of." "Are you threatening me?" he asked, incredulous. "No," I answered truthfully. "I'm setting expectations. Merry Christmas, James." I disconnected the call as I pulled into the parking garage of my office building. It was technically a holiday, but I knew the space would be empty, giving me the quiet I needed to fully formulate my plan. As the CEO, I had access 24/7, and right now, I needed the resources only available there. The security guard looked surprised to see me. "Ms. Navarro, didn't expect anyone today." I managed a smile. "Just need to handle a few things, Marcus. Shouldn't be long." "Family kick you out already?" he joked, then immediately looked mortified. "Sorry, bad joke." The unexpected accuracy of his comment made me pause. "Actually, yes," I admitted, surprising both of us with my candor. "Turns out my in-laws had other plans for me this Christmas." Marcus's expression softened. "Their loss, Ms. Navarro. For what it's worth, my daughter got one of those scholarships from your foundation last month. First in our family headed to business school. What you're doing for girls from struggling neighborhoods, it's changing lives." I hadn't known that. The Navarro Educational Foundation was something I'd started quietly after my first major investment success, naming it after my grandmother who had insisted on my education despite the village's old-fashioned views. We'd provided over 30 full scholarships to young women from underserved communities. I'm glad to hear that, Marcus. Education changed my life. I'm hoping it does the same for those students. "Sure will." He nodded firmly. "Way more than those fancy families with their noses in the air ever did for anybody. You remember that? Today." As I rode the elevator to the executive floor, Marcus's words echoed in my mind. I had been so focused on fitting into the Montgomery family that I'd nearly forgotten what I'd built independently of them. The Educational Foundation, my international artisan platform, the investments and financial structures I'd created. I wasn't just James Montgomery's socially awkward wife from the wrong side of the Atlantic, trying desperately to win his father's approval. I was Sophia Navarro, CEO of Artisan Ventures International with an investment portfolio that would make Richard Montgomery's eyes water, and a reputation in international business circles that had nothing to do with my marriage. In my office, I pulled up the records for Vineyard Capital Partners LLC. There it was, the paperwork showing ownership of the Montgomery Vineyard debt. I'd established the LLC using my maiden name and a business address, keeping it separate from our personal finances. James had signed the paperwork without reading it closely, trusting me implicitly with what he called the boring stuff. The terms were reasonable. I wasn't a predatory lender, but there were clauses about timely payment and conditions that would trigger certain actions. Conditions that would almost certainly come into play once our joint finances were separated. I leaned back in my chair, looking out over the Boston skyline, the same view I'd stared at through tears last night. But today, I wasn't crying. Today, I was planning. My mother had raised me on a simple principle. They can take your land, they can take your home, but they can't take what's in your head. Her wisdom had guided me to prioritize education, to build skills no one could take away. Those skills had brought me here, to this moment of clear-eyed calculation as I mapped out my next steps. The Montgomerys had taken my Christmas, my marriage, and my illusions about family, but they had no idea what I was about to take from them in return. Their sense of security, their control, and most importantly, their assumption of superiority. I opened a new document and titled it Strategic Dissolution Plan. Below it, I outlined phases for the coming months: financial separations, legal preparations, business realignments, and contingencies. Phase 1 would begin today. By the time we reached Phase 3, Richard Montgomery would understand exactly who he had underestimated. My phone buzzed with a text from an unexpected source, Eleanor's husband, David. I had no part in what happened last night. For what it's worth, I think they were completely out of line. Are you okay? I stared at the text, unsure how to respond. David had always been the quiet one at family gatherings, a neuroscientist who'd married into the Montgomery dynasty and never quite found his footing within it. We'd shared knowing glances during particularly pretentious wine discussions, but rarely spoke directly. "I'm fine," I typed back, then paused. Something prompted me to add, "But I appreciate you checking. It means more than you know." His response was immediate. "They don't speak for all of us, just so you know." A small kindness, but it landed like a life raft in an ocean of betrayal. Perhaps not everyone had seen me through Richard's distorted lens after all. I set my phone aside and turned back to my computer. David's text was a welcome reminder that the world wasn't as black and white as it had seemed in the raw aftermath of last night's humiliation. But sentiment wouldn't protect me now. Only strategy would. Before I could outline Phase 2 of my plan, I needed to understand what my life had been before last night's implosion. Not just the surface reality, but the underlying truth I'd been blind to for 3 years. I'd met James Montgomery during my final year at Harvard Business School. I was there on a combination of scholarships and student loans, working part-time at a tech incubator to cover expenses. He was there because generations of Montgomerys had attended, their names etched on buildings and benches throughout campus. Our meeting at a charity auction, both of us bidding on the same rare wine, had seemed like fate at the time. James had been drawn to my intensity, my clear sense of purpose. I'd been captivated by his easy charm, his ability to move through the world without the constant calculation poverty had taught me. When he'd introduced me to his family 6 months later, I'd been determined to win them over. Looking back now, I could see how that determination had set an unhealthy pattern. Richard's initial chill, "Oh, you're from rural Spain. How quaint. We don't get to that part of Europe much except for the major vineyards," had only intensified. My resolve to prove myself worthy. I pulled out a legal pad and began to map the trajectory of our relationship. The early years when I'd worked at an international consulting firm, while James pursued half-hearted projects at his family's vineyard. His family's thinly veiled surprise when he'd chosen to stay with the family business rather than pursue more serious interests. The way Victoria had implied it was somehow my fault, my practical influence steering him toward complacency. The irony, of course, was that I'd encouraged James to pursue his passion for sustainable viticulture. The research into organic methods and climate adaptation would have been logical advantages for the vineyard's future, but Richard had insisted traditional approaches were best. I'd supported James's vision wholeheartedly while quietly ensuring our financial future through my own career and investment decisions. I'd risen from consultant to startup advisor to founder, eventually launching Artisan Ventures International, where my international background, so looked down upon by the Montgomerys, had proven to be my greatest asset. I understood how global markets worked from both sides, the artisan producers struggling for fair compensation and the luxury markets hungry for authenticity. This dual perspective made me exceptional at my job, earning investment rounds and partnerships that had gradually shifted the economic balance in our marriage. For years, it hadn't mattered. James seemed proud of my success, happy to enjoy the lifestyle my income provided while pursuing projects he found meaningful. We'd built a comfortable life in a historic Beacon Hill townhouse, traveled extensively, and never argued about money, largely because I managed it all. When had things changed? I tapped my pen against the legal pad, trying to pinpoint the first fracture. The international launch of my platform 6 months ago had been a seismic shift. Suddenly, I wasn't just successful, I was prominent. My photo in international business publications, speaking engagements at economic forums, invitations to join prestigious boards. The congratulatory messages had poured in from everyone, including Victoria, who'd sent an elaborate flower arrangement to my office with a note reading, "The Montgomery family is so proud of your achievement." The Montgomery family, not we or I, as if my accomplishment belonged to them somehow. Another jewel in their dynastic crown. A week after the platform launch, Richard had invited us to Sunday dinner. "We should discuss how this affects your family planning," he'd said casually over dessert. "These executive positions can be so demanding. Perhaps you should consider freezing your eggs before it's too late." I'd been 34 at the time, certainly not beyond childbearing years. But the implication was clear. My career success was a threat to what Richard considered my primary purpose, providing Montgomery grandchildren. James had laughed uncomfortably. "Dad, we've talked about this. Kids aren't in our immediate plans." Richard had fixed him with a look I now recognized all too well. "Plans change, dear boy. Priorities shift. Family legacy is what matters in the end." Looking back, I could see how that dinner had been the beginning of a campaign. Weekly calls from Victoria with articles about female executives stepping back for family. Comments about James's cousin whose wife had found true fulfillment after leaving her architecture practice to raise children. Suggestions that James must feel emasculated by my new prominence and travel schedule. I'd ignored it all, too busy navigating global expansion to recognize the undermining happening behind the scenes. And James, who'd once found his family's interference amusing, had started listening. Small comments had slipped into our conversations. "Don't you think you're working too much?" And, "We hardly see each other anymore." Valid concerns, perhaps, but tinged with something I couldn't quite identify at the time. Now, I recognized it as Richard's influence, his worldview seeping into our marriage like poison. The Christmas disaster hadn't come from nowhere. It had been carefully orchestrated, with James as both victim and accomplice. Richard had been working on him for months, reframing my success as his failure, my financial acumen as control, my independence as a threat to their family structure. I forced myself to confront the hardest truth. James had let it happen. The man I'd loved for 3 years, who'd once admired my strength, had chosen his father's approval over our partnership. Perhaps he always would have, given the right pressure at the right moment. My phone rang again, this time an unfamiliar number with the Boston area code. "Sophia Navarro," I answered, my professional voice automatically engaging. "Ms. Navarro, this is Patricia Winters from Cambridge Trust." The name was vaguely familiar, a loan officer I'd had minimal dealings with through one of my investment vehicles. "I apologize for calling during the holiday, but there seems to be an unusual flag on the Montgomery Vineyard loan. The system shows you as the contact person for the holding company." I straightened in my chair. "Yes, that's correct." "Well, we've received notification of an impending status change on the account. I was hoping to clarify the situation before processing." This was unexpected. The only trigger for a status change would be, "Mr. Montgomery came in this morning to inquire about removing you from their loan communications," she continued, confirming my suspicion. "Standard procedure requires us to notify all parties on connected financial instruments. When I processed the inquiry, it triggered an automatic alert on the loan held by Vineyard Capital Partners. James had moved quickly, more quickly than I'd anticipated, which meant Richard's influence was even stronger than I'd realized. He'd gone to the bank first thing on December 26th to financially cut me off, a strategic move I might have admired if it wasn't so personally devastating. "Thank you for the notification, Ms. Winters. The alert is functioning as designed. Please proceed with Mr. Montgomery's request regarding the account communications. The loan situation will be handled separately by Vineyard Capital Partners. You should expect formal communication within the week." "Of course, Ms. Navarro. Again, I apologize for the holiday interruption." After ending the call, I sat motionless, absorbing this new development. James wasn't just following his father's script. He was actively trying to limit my financial connection to their family. He clearly didn't understand the full implications of what he'd set in motion. I turned back to my computer and began drafting a formal letter from Vineyard Capital Partners LLC to the current management of Montgomery Family Vineyards. It was time to initiate Phase 2. 3 hours later, I left my office with a comprehensive plan in place. The holiday had worked to my advantage. The emptiness of the building had allowed me to focus without interruption, to transform raw emotion into calculated action. As I drove back to the hotel, I felt a strange sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in years. My phone had accumulated dozens of notifications, mostly from friends and colleagues who'd seen James's abrupt relationship status change on social media. Apparently, he'd wasted no time making our separation public. The caption, "Sometimes the hardest decisions are the most necessary for personal growth," had garnered sympathetic responses from his network, effectively controlling the narrative. Before I'd had a chance to process what was happening, I didn't bother responding to the flood of concerned messages. Social media optics were the least of my concerns right now. Let James have his performative moment of self-discovery. The real situation would unfold on a much different timeline than the carefully curated version he was presenting to the world. At the hotel, I requested to extend my stay for 2 weeks while I sought more permanent accommodations. The thought of finding a new home hadn't fully registered until that moment. Our townhouse was jointly owned, but I had no desire to fight for it. Better to make a clean break, to build something that had no association with the Montgomerys or their influence. That evening, I ordered room service and opened my laptop again. If James was already separating our finances, I needed to accelerate certain aspects of my plan. First, I transferred my personal portion of our joint savings to my individual account, exactly half, not a penny more or less. Next, I emailed our financial advisor, Stephen Wells, with instructions to freeze our joint investment portfolio pending legal division. Then, I contacted the 3 credit cards we shared and requested immediate removal from the accounts. Every action was measured, documented, and precisely in accordance with standard divorce financial protocols. I would not give James or his family any ammunition to paint me as vindictive or grasping. When this was over, no one would be able to claim I had acted with anything but textbook propriety. The vineyard loan situation was different. That was business, not personal. A distinction the Montgomerys had never quite grasped, but would soon come to understand intimately. I was about to shut down my computer when an email notification appeared from James, sent to my personal account rather than my work address. Subject: moving forward. Sophia, I know yesterday was difficult, and I apologize for how things unfolded. That wasn't how I wanted to have this conversation. Dad can be overwhelming when he feels protective, but his heart was in the right place. I've spoken with Harrison about handling our separation with minimal conflict. I think it's best if I remain in the townhouse for now, since your new business success should make finding alternate housing easier for you. I'm prepared to be generous about dividing our assets despite the financial imbalance your recent success has created. I hope we can keep this civilized. Despite everything, I still care about you and want the best for both of us as we move on to new chapters. James P.S. I've taken the liberty of removing you from our household accounts to prevent any confusion during the transition. Harrison advised this was standard procedure. The breathtaking presumptuousness of the message left me momentarily speechless. The financial imbalance he referenced so delicately was in fact my years of careful investment and career advancement that had allowed us to live well beyond what his trust fund disbursements could have provided. His concern about my ability to find housing with my new business success ignored the fact that I'd been out-earning him for most of our marriage. And the casual mention of Harrison Winters, whom he believed was his attorney rather than a lawyer who would never take his case against me, was almost comical in its misplaced confidence. I closed the laptop without responding. Some revelations were best delivered in person at precisely the right moment. James's email had only confirmed what my strategic planning had already assumed. He was operating with incomplete information and misplaced confidence. That combination would work to my advantage in the weeks ahead. The next morning, I woke early and went for a run along the Charles River. Physical activity had always cleared my head, and I needed complete mental clarity for today's tasks. First on my agenda was finding an apartment. Boston's rental market was notoriously tight, especially in the neighborhoods I preferred, but I had connections through my position at Artisan Ventures. By noon, I'd secured a furnished two-bedroom in a restored Victorian in Cambridge, ironically in a building owned by a real estate investment trust that one of my funds had helped finance. Next was the meeting I'd been both dreading and anticipating, lunch with Carter Jenkins to formally discuss my situation. Carter had suggested we meet at his office, but I preferred neutral territory. We agreed on a quiet restaurant in Brookline, away from downtown where we might encounter mutual acquaintances. Carter arrived precisely on time, his silver hair immaculately styled, his manner more subdued than usual. He ordered sparkling water and waited until our server had departed before speaking. I received an interesting call from James Montgomery yesterday, he began, studying me over his reading glasses. He seems to be under the impression that Harrison Winters will be representing him in your divorce proceedings. And what did you tell him? I asked, sipping my iced tea. That Harrison has a conflict of interest, of course. I referred him to Patricia Davies across town. He set his water glass down deliberately. What I didn't mention was the nature of that conflict, specifically my long-standing representation of both you personally and Vineyard Capital Partners, LLC. I nodded, appreciating his discretion. And how did he take the referral? With some surprise. Apparently, his father had assured him Harrison would take care of everything. Richard has a rather inflated sense of his influence in this town. His expression softened slightly. I'm sorry about all this, Sophia. 3 years is a long time to invest in a relationship that ends so abruptly. It is, I agreed. But I'm discovering the relationship ended long before Christmas dinner. I just didn't recognize the signs. Carter nodded, unsurprised. He'd been in divorce law long enough to know how marriages could erode invisibly until a triggering event brought the damage into sudden, stark relief. "Let's discuss your priorities," he said, shifting to business mode as our salads arrived. "Based on the circumstances, Massachusetts' equitable distribution laws should work in your favor, particularly given the financial contributions you've made to the marriage." "I'm not concerned about the divorce settlement," I said, surprising him. "James can keep the townhouse. We can split the investment portfolio exactly down the middle. I won't contest anything except attempts to diminish my professional reputation." Carter's eyebrows rose. "That's unusually generous given the circumstances." "It's not generosity, it's efficiency. I want this chapter closed quickly so I can move forward unencumbered." I leaned forward slightly. "My primary concern is protecting Vineyard Capital Partners and ensuring its business dealings remain separate from our personal matters." Understanding dawned in Carter's eyes. "Ah, the Vineyard loan." "The Vineyard loan," I confirmed. "When the Montgomery Vineyard faced that catastrophic frost 3 years ago, they were 2 payments from bankruptcy. The holding company I created purchased the debt at a substantial discount due to the risk factor, then restructured the terms to give them breathing room." "Which they've been faithfully paying," Carter noted. "Largely thanks to my contributions to the family finances," I pointed out. "But now that James has separated our accounts and I'll no longer be contributing to the household income, I anticipate they'll struggle to maintain the payment schedule." Carter's expression remained neutral, but I could see his legal mind, calculating the implications. "And when they miss a payment?" "When they miss a payment, Vineyard Capital Partners will follow standard business protocol for addressing delinquency." I met his gaze steadily. "I won't be vindictive, Carter, but I also won't extend special consideration to people who showed me none." He nodded slowly. "I understand. I'll ensure all communications from the LLC are properly formatted and legally sound. However," he added with characteristic caution, "I should advise you that using the Vineyard loan as leverage in divorce proceedings could potentially—" "I'm not using it as leverage," I interrupted. "I'm simply allowing normal business processes to proceed without interference. The timing is coincidental." A slight smile played at the corner of his mouth. "Of course. Purely coincidental." By the time lunch concluded, we had outlined a comprehensive approach to both the divorce and the Vineyard loan situation. Carter would handle all communications, ensuring appropriate legal distance between my personal circumstances and the business operations of Vineyard Capital Partners. As we were preparing to leave, Carter paused. "One more thing, Sophia. Victoria Montgomery called my office this morning." I stilled. "What did she want?" "To inform me that James's decision to pursue divorce was fully supported by the family, and that they expected my cooperation in ensuring a fair outcome that respected the Montgomery family's position in the community." His tone was bone dry. "And your response?" "I informed her that all communication regarding her son's divorce should come through his own legal representation, not his mother." He adjusted his tie with precise movements. She didn't appreciate my suggestion. "I can imagine," I said, unable to suppress a small smile at the mental image of Victoria's reaction. She was accustomed to deference, particularly from Boston's professional class, who often depended on connections to old money families like the Montgomerys. "One last piece of advice," Carter said as we walked to our cars. "Don't underestimate Richard. He values appearances above all else. And right now, you represent a threat to how the family is perceived. He'll fight to control the narrative regardless of the cost." "I'm counting on it," I replied, the winter sunlight casting long shadows across the parking lot. "Some people show their true nature only when they believe they're winning." Later that afternoon, as I was settling into my hotel room to review work emails, my phone rang with Eleanor's number. I hesitated before answering, unsure what James's sister could possibly have to say that I needed to hear. "Sophia, it's Eleanor." Her voice carried the same cultured Boston accent as her mother's, though without Victoria's razor edge. "I hope it's all right that I'm calling." "That depends on why you're calling," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. A pause. "I wanted to apologize for Christmas. For not speaking up when Dad was, well, when everything happened." The apology was unexpected, especially given her message in the family group chat afterward. "Thank you," I said cautiously. "But I saw your text Eleanor about how my departure was overdue." She exhaled sharply. "God, I'm such a coward sometimes. Mom was reading all our responses. You know how she gets when she's on a mission." I did know. Victoria's missions had shaped family events for years. Campaigns to persuade Richard to update the vineyard's image, to convince Eleanor's brother Thomas to break up with an unsuitable girlfriend, to pressure various family members into compliance with her vision of what the Montgomerys should be. "Why are you really calling?" I asked, too emotionally drained for social niceties. "Because David read me the riot act after Christmas dinner," she admitted. "Said we were all complicit in something ugly and mean. He's right, of course. We've always let Mom and Dad steamroll everyone, and you got the worst of it because I wasn't born a Montgomery," I finished for her. "Yes," she said quietly. "That's exactly it. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know not everyone agrees with what happened, even if we weren't brave enough to say so at the time." It was an olive branch of sorts, though a flimsy one. Still, in the emotional wasteland of the past 2 days, even this small acknowledgement of wrongdoing felt significant. "I appreciate the call," I said finally, "but I need to focus on moving forward now." "Of course I understand." She hesitated before adding, "Just so you know, Dad's on the warpath. He's already talking to the family about how to handle the divorce to minimize disruption to the Montgomery reputation." I wasn't surprised, but the confirmation was useful. "Thanks for the warning." After ending the call, I added this new information to my strategic assessment. Richard was mobilizing the family to protect their image, which meant he saw me as a threat rather than an irrelevance. That perception would shape his actions in the coming weeks, potentially making him more aggressive, but also more predictable. I glanced at the calendar on my phone. 6 weeks until the vineyard's major. Loan payment would be due. 6 weeks until the first test of their financial stability without my contribution. 6 weeks until phase 3 of my plan truly began. The woman who had sat crying in her car on Christmas night was already receding like a tide pulling back from shore. In her place stood someone clearer-eyed and resolute. Someone who understood that the greatest revenge wouldn't come from anger or spite, but from allowing natural consequences to unfold with precision and patience. Richard Montgomery had never respected me. Soon, he would have no choice. The next morning, I woke to an email notification that temporarily knocked me off balance. It was from Artisan Ventures International's board chairman requesting an urgent meeting at 10 a.m. No further details provided. My mind raced through possibilities, none of them positive. Had Richard or Victoria contacted my investors? Were they attempting to undermine my professional standing as well? I showered and dressed with particular care, selecting a tailored, charcoal suit and the emerald earrings I'd bought myself after securing our Series B funding. Whatever this meeting entailed, I would face it with poise and preparation. Arriving at my company's offices, I was immediately ushered into our main conference room where Gregory Harmon, our chairman, sat with Nadia Chen, our chief legal counsel, and Marcus Whitfield, our lead investor. Their expressions gave nothing away. "Sophia," Gregory began after I'd taken a seat, "thank you for coming in on such short notice, especially given what I understand has been a challenging personal situation." So they knew. The question was, what exactly did they know, and how had they learned it? "We received a rather unusual call yesterday," Nadia said, answering my unspoken question. "From Richard Montgomery, I kept my expression neutral, despite the surge of anger I felt. I see. May I ask what Mr. Montgomery wanted? Marcus glanced at his notes. He expressed concerns about potential conflicts of interest regarding your position as CEO and certain personal investment vehicles you manage. Specifically, he mentioned Vineyard Capital Partners, LLC. The audacity was breathtaking. Richard hadn't even waited for James's divorce paperwork to be filed before attempting to damage my professional reputation. He'd gone straight for what he perceived as my vulnerability, the separation between my personal investments and my fiduciary responsibility to Artisan Ventures. I understand, I said calmly, and I appreciate you bringing this to my attention directly rather than making assumptions. Gregory leaned forward. Sophia, you've built this company from the ground up. Your integrity has never been in question, but given the nature of the allegations and your position, we needed to address this immediately. Of course, I agreed. Transparency is essential. Vineyard Capital Partners is indeed my company, established 3 years ago as a vehicle for personal investments in agricultural enterprises. It's fully documented in my annual disclosure forms as required by our company's ethics policy. I removed a folder from my briefcase, the one I'd prepared last night, anticipating some form of attack from the Montgomerys, though I hadn't expected it to come so quickly or directly. This contains the complete documentation of Vineyard, Capital's formation, its investments, and the full disclosure history to our compliance department. You'll note that all activities fall well within our company's guidelines for executive personal investments. Nadia took the folder, scanning the contents with practiced efficiency. The Montgomery Vineyard loan acquisition included on page 4, I confirmed. The transaction was executed through standard channels at prevailing market rates when the previous lender was preparing to foreclose. All terms are conventional and compliant with industry standards. Gregory and Marcus exchanged glances as Nadia continued reviewing the documentation. After several minutes, she closed the folder and nodded to Gregory. Everything appears to be in order. The disclosures were properly filed and approved by compliance at the time of acquisition. There's no conflict with the company's interests or policies. Gregory's expression softened slightly. I had expected as much, but we needed to verify given the assertive nature of Mr. Montgomery's claims. May I ask what specifically he alleged? I inquired, maintaining my professional tone despite my internal fury. Nadia hesitated before responding. He suggested that you had used insider knowledge from your international artisan network to identify distressed agricultural properties at below market value, and that you were now threatening foreclosure on his family vineyard to gain leverage in your divorce proceedings. The calculated manipulation of facts was impressive in a disturbing way. Richard had taken the bare elements of truth and twisted them into something sinister. I understand how serious these allegations are, I said. The morning of the scheduled meeting dawned with unusual clarity for a February day in Massachusetts. The sky was a brilliant blue as my driver navigated the winding country roads toward Montgomery Vineyards. I'd chosen to arrive by private jet, not out of theatricality but practicality. I had been in Dubai finalizing our expansion into Middle Eastern luxury markets, and flying directly to the small airfield adjacent to the vineyard property made logistical sense. That it would create a dramatic entrance was merely a fortunate coincidence. I reviewed my notes one final time as we approached the estate. The past 6 weeks had unfolded exactly as I'd anticipated, with the Montgomerys oscillating between aggressive legal maneuvers and desperate attempts to maintain their financial stability. 2 weeks after Christmas, I had received the expected call from Carter. Patricia Davies reached out with their initial proposal. He'd begun, his tone suggesting he found something amusing about the situation. It's creative, I'll give them that. Creative how? I'd asked, bracing for whatever scheme Richard had concocted. They're proposing that Vineyard Capital Partners forgive the Montgomery loan entirely, reclassifying it as a wedding gift that was always intended to be a contribution to the family. In exchange, they're offering to waive any claim to your company equity and intellectual property. I couldn't help but laugh at the audacity. So they want me to erase a $3 million secured loan as a gift, essentially handing them complete ownership of a property they nearly lost to foreclosure, in exchange for not pursuing assets that are already legally protected as separate property. Essentially, yes, Carter confirmed. They're positioning it as a clean break that would benefit both parties. Both parties, meaning the Montgomerys maintain their illusion of financial independence while I absorb the actual cost, I translated. What's Patricia's take on this proposal? She can't seriously think it's reasonable. Reading between the lines of her email, I suspect she's following client instructions against her better judgment, Carter replied diplomatically. She included some language about hoping to find common ground that acknowledges the complexity of family relationships. In other words, Richard drafted the proposal, and Patricia is doing her professional best with impossible parameters, I surmised. That would be my assessment, Carter agreed. How would you like to respond? I considered the options. A flat rejection would likely escalate tensions further, while a counter-proposal might encourage continued attempts at manipulation. Let's acknowledge receipt and indicate we're reviewing the proposal, I decided. Then we wait. The loan payment is due in 4 weeks. Let's see if it arrives on time before we engage further. Carter's tone held a note of appreciation. A strategic patience approach. Very well. Now, as my car pulled through the ornate iron gates of Montgomery Vineyards, that patience had paid off. The payment deadline had come and gone with no communication, from the Montgomerys until 3 days ago, when Richard himself had finally called. "Ms. Navarro," he'd said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "I think it's time we resolved this situation face to face. The family is prepared to discuss reasonable terms regarding the vineyard financing. The change in address from Sophia to the formal Ms. Navarro hadn't escaped my notice, a small indicator of how dramatically our relationship had shifted. No longer his son's wife, I was now a business adversary to be managed. "I'm currently in Dubai finalizing our Middle East expansion," I'd replied calmly. "But I can make time in my schedule upon my return. Would Thursday at 10 a.m. at the vineyard work for you?" The brief silence on the line told me he hadn't expected such a reasonable response. "That would be acceptable," he'd finally said. "We'll expect you at the main house." "Actually, I think the meeting would be more productive at the administrative offices," I'd countered. "This is a business matter, after all." Another pause. "As you wish. The administrative building at 10 on Thursday." Now, as we drove past the picturesque rows of dormant grapevines, I could see the administrative building in the distance, a tastefully renovated barn that housed the vineyard's business operations. Adjacent to it was the small airfield where local pilots sometimes landed to visit the vineyard's tasting room. The airfield where my private jet would be landing in approximately 30 minutes, timed perfectly to coincide with my arrival by car first to prepare. The strategy wasn't about showing off wealth, it was about demonstrating reach and resources, sending a clear message that I wasn't operating from a position of emotional vulnerability, but from one of global business strength. The Montgomerys had always viewed me through the narrow lens of their Boston social circle. Today, they would be forced to see me as I truly was, a global business leader whose influence extended far beyond their provincial understanding. My driver stopped in front of the administrative building, where Jennifer Reeves, the vineyard's operations manager, waited nervously by the entrance. I'd met her several times at company events and had always found her to be competent and straightforward. "Ms. Navarro," she greeted me, extending her hand. "This is unexpected. I mean, we expected you for the meeting, but not quite so early." "I prefer to arrive with time to prepare," I explained, accepting her handshake. "I hope that's not an inconvenience." "Not at all," she assured me, though her expression suggested otherwise. "The conference room is ready. Can I get you anything?" Coffee? Coffee would be lovely, thank you. As she led me to the conference room, I noted subtle signs of financial strain throughout the building. Postponed maintenance, outdated equipment, fewer staff than I remembered from previous visits. The vineyard's financial struggles were clearly extending beyond just the loan payment. The conference room offered a spectacular view of the property, including the airfield. Perfect. I checked my watch as Jennifer returned with coffee. 20 minutes until my jet was scheduled to land. Jennifer, I sense things have been difficult here recently, I said gently. How are you holding up? Her professional composure cracked slightly. It's been challenging. The frost damage was worse than initially reported, and there have been management disagreements about the recovery strategy. Richard insisting on traditional methods rather than adapting to climate realities? I guessed. She looked surprised at my insight. Yes, exactly. James had proposed some innovative approaches, but Mr. Montgomery Sr. was resistant. And now? She hesitated. Now, James seems to have lost interest in fighting those battles. He's been more focused on… She trailed off. Personal matters? I supplied. Jennifer nodded uncomfortably. I should let you know that the entire Montgomery family will be attending the meeting. It was Mr. Montgomery's specific request. So Richard was planning a show of unified family strength. Predictable, but ultimately irrelevant to the business at hand. Thank you for the information, Jennifer. I appreciate your professionalism during what must be an awkward situation. She smiled tightly. I just want what's best for the vineyard. We have 30 employees whose livelihoods depend on its success. That fact hadn't escaped my attention. Indeed, it had featured prominently in my strategic planning. Whatever happened with the Montgomerys, I had no intention of allowing those employees to suffer for management's mistakes. I understand completely, I assured her. Whatever the outcome of today's meeting, the vineyard's operations and its employees will be protected. Relief flickered across her face before she excused herself to prepare for the family's arrival. Left alone, I arranged my materials on the conference table, positioning myself at the head where I would have a clear view of both the Montgomery family and the airfield beyond. I checked my phone to confirm my pilot's estimated arrival time. Perfectly on schedule. At precisely 9:55, I heard the sounds of multiple vehicles arriving. Voices in the hallway grew louder as the Montgomery family approached. Richard's authoritative baritone, Victoria's cultured tones, James's lighter tenor, and several others I recognized as Eleanor, her husband David, and Thomas. The full family brigade, just as Jennifer had warned. I stood as they entered, presenting a picture of professional composure in a perfectly tailored suit, not a hint of the emotional woman they'd thrown out at Christmas. Richard stopped short upon seeing me already positioned at the head of the table, momentarily thrown off his script. Victoria's eyes narrowed as she assessed my appearance, perhaps looking for signs of stress or struggle. James simply looked uncomfortable, his gaze darting around the room to avoid meeting mine. Sophia? Richard recovered quickly, striding forward with hand extended. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. Mr. Montgomery, I replied, accepting his handshake with precisely the right amount of pressure. I believe we have important business matters to discuss. The formal address caught him off guard again. Another small seed of doubt planted. Richard Montgomery was accustomed to controlling every interaction, particularly in his own territory. Each disruption to his expected script would further unbalance him. Yes, well, he gestured to the others. I thought it important that the entire family be present, given the significance of the vineyard to our legacy. Of course, I nodded pleasantly. Though I should mention that my legal counsel will be joining us shortly. He's arriving by air. Richard frowned. By air? The Boston traffic must be worse than usual if he needed to charter a helicopter. Not from Boston, I corrected mildly. From Dubai. We've just completed our expansion into the Middle Eastern luxury market. Quite successful. 3 royal families have already signed exclusive distribution agreements for our artisan partners. I delivered this information casually, as if discussing the weather, but I could see its impact ripple through the room. The international scope of my business activities didn't fit with the narrative Richard had undoubtedly constructed about me. The spurned wife desperately clinging to financial leverage. Victoria cleared her throat. How enterprising. Shall we begin? I believe our attorney has prepared some documents that might provide a framework for discussion. In a moment, I said, glancing at my watch. As I mentioned, we're waiting for one more participant. On cue, the distinctive sound of a jet engine grew louder outside the window. All heads turned as the sleek Gulfstream G650 with the Artisan Ventures International logo emblazoned on its side made a perfect approach to the small airfield. Is that? Eleanor began. My company jet, I confirmed. I apologize for the theatrical timing, but I had business in Dubai that couldn't wait, and this was the most efficient way to return for our meeting. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The private jet wasn't just a luxury travel method. It was a physical manifestation of success at a level beyond what the Montgomerys, for all their old money and social connections, had achieved. Richard's face flushed slightly, but he maintained his composure. Let's proceed while your colleague makes his way from the airfield. Certainly, I agreed, opening my portfolio. I understand the vineyard was unable to make its scheduled loan payment 2 weeks ago. Given our previous relationship, Vineyard Capital Partners has been more lenient than most lenders would be in this situation. Patricia Davies, seated beside Richard, cleared her throat. About that. We believe there are extenuating circumstances that should be considered regarding the loan terms. Such as, I inquired politely. The loan itself was created under unusual circumstances, she continued. Our position is that it was always intended as a family assistance measure, not a true arm's-length business transaction. I see. I nodded thoughtfully. And you have documentation supporting this characterization? She hesitated. The context of the relationship at the time clearly indicates. So that's a no, I interjected gently. No documentation stating the $3 million secured loan was actually a gift or family assistance measure. Richard leaned forward. Sophia, let's be reasonable here. We both know this situation has become unnecessarily complicated by personal matters. Our proposal offers a clean resolution that allows everyone to move forward with dignity. I appreciate that perspective, I replied. And I agree completely that personal and business matters should be kept separate. That's why Vineyard Capital Partners has continued to treat this as what it is. A standard business loan with clearly defined terms and conditions. James spoke for the first time. This isn't like you, Sophia. You've always understood the importance of family. The comment might have wounded me weeks ago. Now it struck me as almost laughably misguided. Yes, I do understand the importance of family, I agreed, which is why I saved yours from financial ruin 3 years ago when no one else would take the risk. A knock at the conference room door interrupted the tension. Jennifer entered. Ms. Navarro, your colleague has arrived. The door opened wider to reveal Carter Jenkins, immaculate despite the long flight, carrying a leather portfolio similar to mine. I apologize for the slight delay, he said smoothly, taking the seat beside me. Customs at the private terminal was particularly thorough today. Richard's expression darkened further at this additional symbol of international business operations, something well beyond the primarily domestic scope of the Montgomery ventures. Now that we're all here, I said, let me outline Vineyard Capital Partners' position clearly. The Montgomery Vineyard loan is currently in default. According to standard terms that were agreed upon and signed by all parties, this triggers certain consequences. We're aware of the terms, Richard said stiffly. What we're proposing is a renegotiation based on the special circumstances of our situation. Special circumstances being my divorce from your son, I clarified. A personal matter that you believe should influence a business transaction. Don't be obtuse, Victoria cut in. This entire loan was only structured as it was because of your relationship with James. You can't now pretend it was a standard business arrangement. Actually, I can, I corrected her gently. Because that's exactly what it was. The loan was made at market rates with standard terms through a properly established corporate entity. All documentation reflects this reality. I opened a folder and extracted several papers. What Vineyard Capital Partners is prepared to offer is a restructuring that acknowledges both the Vineyard's current financial challenges and its future potential. Richard blinked, clearly not expecting a constructive proposal from me. Restructuring? Yes, I slid the papers across the table. These terms would extend the repayment period, adjust the interest rate to current market conditions, and include technology modernization provisions to improve production efficiency. Patricia Davies scanned the document with professional interest while Richard and Victoria exchanged confused glances. This is surprisingly reasonable, Patricia acknowledged. There's one additional element, I continued. As part of the restructuring, Vineyard Capital Partners would acquire a 30% equity stake in Montgomery Vineyards, with board representation focused specifically on modernization initiatives and international market development. The silence that followed was profound. For 3 generations, the Montgomerys had maintained complete ownership of their vineyard. The proposal to surrender even a portion of that control was unprecedented. Richard recovered first. Absolutely not. The vineyard remains wholly within the Montgomery family. That's non-negotiable. I nodded, having expected this reaction. I understand your position. Unfortunately, without equity participation, the risk profile doesn't justify the restructured terms. In that case, we would need to proceed with standard default remedies. You would foreclose on a family business out of spite? Victoria asked incredulously. Not out of spite, I corrected her. Out of fiduciary responsibility. Vineyard Capital Partners has investors who expect sound business decisions, not emotional ones. James looked increasingly uncomfortable. There must be another option. There is, I acknowledged. You could secure alternative financing to pay off the existing loan in full. Given the vineyard's current financial situation and the significant frost damage to last year's crop, that might be challenging, but certainly not impossible. Richard's jaw tightened. You've thought of everything, haven't you? That's my job, I said simply. Both as CEO of an international company and as manager of various investment vehicles. Strategic thinking and contingency planning are what I do. The sound of my phone vibrating provided a welcome momentary distraction. I glanced at the screen to see a message from my Dubai team confirming the successful signing of our latest partnership agreement, complete with a photo of me shaking hands with a Saudi prince just 18 hours earlier. I turned the phone, so the screen was visible to the table as I silenced it. Excuse the interruption. Final confirmation of our Middle East expansion signing. The international timestamp on the notification was clearly visible to everyone. Another subtle reminder of my global business operations contrasted with their local vineyard concerns. Back to the matter at hand, I continued. I understand. This is a significant decision that requires careful consideration. Vineyard Capital Partners is prepared to give you 30 days to evaluate these options before proceeding with default remedies. 30 days? Richard scoffed. To completely reconsider the ownership structure of a generational family business? Business conditions don't always align with personal preferences, as I'm sure you know, I replied evenly. The 30-day extension is already a courtesy beyond standard terms. Carter spoke for the first time. If I may add, This restructuring proposal is considerably more favorable than what most commercial lenders would offer in similar circumstances. The equity participation component is designed to align incentives for future growth, not to dilute family control of operations. Patricia Davies nodded reluctantly. He's right, Richard. Given the current default status, these terms are actually quite reasonable. Richard's face had taken on a dangerous crimson hue. His carefully orchestrated family unity display was crumbling as the business reality asserted itself. I'd like to speak with Ms. Navarro privately, he announced suddenly. Victoria looked alarmed. Richard, I don't think— It's all right, I assured her. A brief private conversation might be productive. I nodded to Carter, who gathered his materials and stood. I'll wait outside. The rest of the Montgomery family followed suit, though James hesitated at the door, looking back with an unreadable expression before Victoria firmly guided him out. When the door closed, Richard and I were left facing each other across the conference table. 3 years of forced smiles and polite holiday dinners had culminated in this moment of unvarnished truth. What do you really want, Sophia? He asked, his voice low. Is this about punishing James for the divorce? Making the family pay for how things ended? The question was so fundamentally misguided that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. This isn't about punishment, Richard. It never was. I leaned forward slightly. This is about business. The vineyard took a loan it's now unable to repay. My company is offering reasonable restructuring terms that could potentially benefit both parties. Don't insult my intelligence, he growled. You engineered this entire situation. Did I? I raised an eyebrow. Did I cause the frost that damaged your crop? Did I prevent you from adopting the climate adaptation measures James proposed 2 years ago? Did I force you to maintain your lavish family lifestyle when vineyard revenues were declining? He had no answer for that. You've always seen me as an outsider playing at business, I continued calmly. The scholarship girl who married above her station. You never bothered to understand that while James was coasting on his trust fund and family name, I was building something substantial, something global. I gestured toward the window where my private jet sat gleaming in the winter sun. That aircraft isn't for show, Richard. It's a business tool that allows me to negotiate with royal families in the Middle East one day and attend a vineyard loan meeting in Massachusetts the next. The company it represents employs over 200 people across 12 countries and generates annual revenues that would make your vineyard look like a hobby project. His eyes narrowed. So, this is about proving your success? No, I shook my head. That's the fundamental misunderstanding you've always had about me. I don't need to prove anything to you or your family. My success speaks for itself to the people who matter in my world. My investors, my employees, my artisan partners. I closed my portfolio deliberately. The equity offer is genuine, Richard. Montgomery Vineyards has a strong heritage brand. That could be leveraged in international markets, particularly with the right technology investments and climate adaptation strategies. That's not revenge. It's a valid business opportunity. And if we refuse? Then you have 30 days to secure alternative financing or face standard default proceedings. I met his gaze directly. Business, not personal. Richard stared at me for a long moment. For the first time since I'd known him, I saw something new in his eyes. A reluctant reassessment. You're not who I thought you were, he said finally. I never was, I replied simply. That was the problem all along. Richard called the family back into the conference room with a grim expression that told me he'd come to a decision. They filed in silently, reading the tension in the air. James looked particularly unsettled, his earlier confidence replaced by a dawning awareness that events had spiraled beyond his control. We'll need the full 30 days to consider these options, Richard announced stiffly. In the meantime, Jennifer will provide complete access to the vineyard's financial records and operational data to assist in the evaluation process. It was a significant concession, allowing an outsider to examine the inner workings of the Montgomery family. Business. Victoria's sharp intake of breath made it clear she hadn't been consulted on this decision. That's a sensible approach, I acknowledged. Transparency will benefit everyone involved. As the meeting concluded, I gathered my materials unhurriedly. The Montgomerys were already discussing logistics in hushed tones, their family dynamic, visibly strained by this unexpected turn of events. Only James lingered as the others filed out, clearly wanting to speak privately. When we were alone, he seemed at a loss for words. "The private jet is impressive," he finally said, awkwardly filling the silence. "It's a business necessity," I replied. "When you're negotiating deals across 5 continents, commercial flight schedules become a significant limitation." He nodded, shifting uncomfortably. "I didn't know." "About Dubai. About how big your company had become." "You never asked," I pointed out. "Not really. You saw the success, enjoyed the benefits, but you never wanted to understand the substance behind it." His gaze dropped. To the conference table. "Dad says you planned this all along, the loan, everything. That you set up the family for some kind of elaborate revenge." The accusation was so absurd, I almost laughed. "James, when I created the loan structure 3 years ago, we were happily married. I was helping your family because they were my family too, or so I thought." "Then why come back like this?" He gestured vaguely toward the window where my jet was visible. The dramatic entrance, the tough negotiation stance. It feels personal. "It's not personal. It's strategic," I corrected him. "The jet is here because I flew in from Dubai. The negotiation stance reflects the vineyard's actual financial situation. The fact that it makes your family uncomfortable is incidental, not intentional." "So none of this is about Christmas? About how things ended between us?" I studied him for a moment, this man I'd once believed was my partner. "Christmas was a symptom, not the disease, James. It simply revealed what had been true all along, that your family never saw me as an equal, and when pushed, neither did you." He flinched at the accuracy of my assessment. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I'm sorry for how everything happened." "I'm not." I surprised myself with the realization. Not anymore. Christmas was painful but necessary. It forced me to see reality clearly and make changes I might have avoided otherwise. Changes like becoming a hardened businesswoman who swoops in on a private jet to take partial ownership of a family vineyard. There was a hint of the old James in his wry tone. Changes like valuing myself enough to stop shrinking to make others comfortable, I corrected him. The business success was already happening, James. The difference is that now I don't downplay it to protect fragile egos. He absorbed this in silence, perhaps truly seeing me for the first time since we'd met. "What happens now?" he finally asked. "Now I fly to New York for meetings with our North American retail partners. And you and your family spend 30 days deciding whether tradition is more important than survival." As I walked toward the door, he called after me. "The vineyard is everything to my father. You know that." I turned back one last time. Then, he should have valued it enough to adapt when times changed. That's the lesson I learned from my family's olive grove. Traditions matter, but evolution ensures survival. Outside, Carter was waiting beside the car. "Productive conversation?" "Surprisingly so," I replied. "Sometimes clarity is its own victory." As we drove toward the airfield, I gazed out at the dormant vineyard. Despite everything, I could still appreciate its stark winter beauty and potential. The Montgomery vineyard had a rich heritage that deserved preservation, even if it's current. Stewards were resistant to necessary changes. That thought crystallized something I'd been considering throughout the meeting. A way forward that might serve everyone's interests without requiring the Montgomerys to abandon their pride entirely. "Carter," I said as we approached the jet. I'd like you to develop an alternative restructuring proposal, something that preserves family control while still addressing the modernization needs. He glanced at me with mild surprise. Not planning to push for the equity stake after all? The equity proposal was designed to make the straight refinancing terms look reasonable by comparison, I explained, and to make a point about the real power dynamics at play. But taking ownership might not be the optimal business outcome. The Montgomery brand is intertwined with their family story. Separating the two could diminish its value. Carter's expression shifted to one of appreciation. Strategic negotiation at its finest. Create leverage, then use it to craft the deal. You actually won it all along. Precisely. I nodded. Success isn't about crushing opposition. It's about creating scenarios where everyone believes they've achieved their primary objectives. As we boarded the jet, I felt a sudden lightness. The meeting hadn't gone as the Montgomerys expected, but it had unfolded exactly according to my strategy. Not out of vindictiveness, but because I'd finally stopped playing by rules designed to keep me subordinate. The next 30 days passed in a blur of international business activities. Berlin, Singapore, São Paulo, London, each destination representing new partnerships for Artisan Ventures International. My team had leveraged the Middle East success into unprecedented growth across luxury markets worldwide. While I focused on expansion, Carter kept me updated on developments with Montgomery Vineyards. Richard had grudgingly allowed our financial consultants to examine the vineyard's operations, revealing inefficiencies and outdated practices that explained much of their current distress. They're leaving millions on the table with their current distribution model, Carter explained during one of our weekly calls. Direct-to-consumer sales alone could increase their margins by 30%. Have you shared these findings with them? I asked. Jennifer has been surprisingly receptive, he replied. She's presented several of our recommendations to Richard already. James, interestingly, has become more engaged in the process than expected. That was unexpected. James is participating in the financial reviews? More than participating, he's championing some of the proposed changes. Apparently, your conversation sparked something. He mentioned that your family had successfully modernized an olive grove while maintaining its heritage. I smiled at that. My grandfather would have appreciated the comparison. He'd always said that the strongest traditions were those flexible enough to bend with changing times. 2 weeks into the evaluation period, I received an unexpected call from Eleanor. Sophia, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. I'm between meetings, I assured her, curious about the purpose of her call. What can I do for you? It's about James, she began hesitantly. He's different since your meeting at the vineyard. More focused, more engaged with the business than I've ever seen him. That's good news for the vineyard, I observed neutrally. It is, she agreed. But there's more. He's been arguing with Dad about implementing your consultant's recommendations immediately. They had a huge fight last night when Dad rejected the climate adaptation proposals again. This was interesting development. James had never directly confronted his father in business matters before. And why are you telling me this? I asked. Because I think you should know that your visit didn't just change the vineyard's financial outlook, it's changing our family dynamics too. She paused briefly. James mentioned something about how you saved your family's olive grove when everyone said it couldn't be done. Is that true? It's true, I confirmed. When I was in business school, a disease threatened to wipe out our 100-year-old trees. The traditional approach was to destroy them all and start over, but I researched alternative treatments and convinced my grandfather to try them. We saved 80% of the original grove. He's been telling that story to anyone who'll listen, Eleanor said. I think he finally sees what the rest of us missed all these years. After we hung up, I sat thoughtfully in my hotel suite overlooking the London skyline. James's apparent transformation was unexpected, but not unwelcome. Perhaps seeing me in my element, confident, strategic, globally successful, had finally broken through his family's carefully constructed narrative about who I was and what I was capable of. On day 28 of the 30-day evaluation period, I received an email from Richard Montgomery himself, the first direct communication since our meeting at the vineyard. Ms. Navarro, after extensive review and consideration, the Montgomery family would like to propose an alternative restructuring arrangement for the vineyard loan. While we appreciate the comprehensive assessment your team has provided, we believe we can address the identified issues while maintaining our family's historical connection to the business. If agreeable, I would like to meet to discuss these matters in person rather than through intermediaries. Your schedule permitting, perhaps you could visit the vineyard again next week? Regards, Richard Montgomery. The formal tone couldn't quite mask what this message represented. Richard Montgomery was extending an olive branch. Not an apology, certainly, but an acknowledgement that the path forward required compromise. I forwarded the email to Carter with a brief note. Progress. Let's see what they've come up with. His response came quickly. Interesting development. According to Jennifer, James has been leading a major internal push for modernization. Perhaps there's more to your ex-husband than we thought. That evening, as I prepared for my presentation at London's Luxury Goods Summit, I found myself reflecting on how dramatically my life had changed since Christmas. The pain of that public rejection had transformed into something unexpected, a catalyst for growth, for asserting my true worth without apology. I scheduled my return to Boston for the following week, arranging to meet Richard at the vineyard after concluding essential business in the city. This time, I would arrive by car. The point about my global business stature had been made, and repeating the private jet entrance would be unnecessarily theatrical. When I arrived at Montgomery Vineyards, I was surprised to find only Richard and James waiting in the conference room. The full family brigade had been reduced to the two most relevant decision-makers, another sign that this meeting would be substantively different from the last. Sophia, Richard greeted me, rising from his seat. The formal Ms. Navarro had been replaced with my first name, not quite warm, but less adversarial. Thank you for making time in what I understand is an extremely demanding schedule. My team keeps things running smoothly, I replied, taking the offered seat. I understand you have an alternative proposal to discuss. James slid a folder across the table. We've developed a comprehensive restructuring plan that incorporates many of your consultants' recommendations while preserving family ownership. I opened the folder and began reviewing the contents. The proposal was surprisingly thorough. Debt, restructuring, operational modernization, climate adaptation measures, and a revised distribution strategy that embraced direct-to-consumer sales. This is impressive work, I acknowledged, genuinely surprised by the quality of the plan. You've addressed most of the critical issues identified during the evaluation. James deserves the credit, Richard said, with what appeared to be reluctant pride. He's taken the lead on this initiative. I glanced at James, who looked more energized and engaged than I'd seen him in years. You developed this? He nodded. With Jennifer's help and some input from your consultants. The climate adaptation strategies are similar to what I proposed 2 years ago, but with updates based on the latest research. The financing structure is creative, I noted, examining the numbers. You're proposing to maintain full ownership while creating a preferred dividend structure for Vineyard Capital Partners based on performance improvements. Yes, James confirmed. Rather than equity participation, you would receive enhanced returns as the vineyard achieves specific growth milestones. It aligns our incentives while preserving the family connection to the business. It was a sophisticated approach that addressed my concerns about investment return while allowing the Montgomerys to maintain their treasured control. The proposal demonstrated a level of financial acumen I hadn't previously seen from James. This has potential, I said thoughtfully. though I have some questions about the implementation timeline and accountability mechanisms. Of course. Richard nodded. We anticipated you would want to discuss those details. For the next 2 hours, we engaged in substantive negotiations about terms, conditions, and verification procedures. The conversation was remarkably productive, focused entirely on business considerations rather than personal history. As we finalized the framework agreement, Richard cleared his throat. There's one additional matter I'd like to address, if you're willing. I looked at him expectantly. The events at Christmas were— He paused, clearly uncomfortable. Not our family's finest moment. While I don't expect this business agreement to erase that history, I want to acknowledge that our treatment of you was unacceptable. It wasn't quite an apology, but from Richard Montgomery, this admission represented significant personal growth. Thank you for saying that, I replied simply. Business and personal matters are separate, but that acknowledgement is appreciated. James looked relieved at this exchange, as if a weight had been lifted. We've also reconsidered our position. On the divorce settlement, he added, I've instructed Patricia to withdraw our previous demands and proceed with an equitable division, as you originally proposed. This was unexpected, a complete reversal of their earlier aggressive stance. What prompted this change? Perspective, James admitted. Seeing you arrive in that private jet, leading international negotiations while simultaneously handling our vineyard situation, it made me realize how small I've been thinking all these years, how much I've taken for granted. Richard nodded in agreement. The Montgomery name opens doors in Boston society, but your business acumen has opened doors worldwide. That deserves respect, regardless of personal circumstances. Their words represented a fundamental shift in perspective, not just about me personally, but about what constituted real success and achievement. The old money snobbery that had defined our relationship had been replaced by genuine professional respect. As we concluded our meeting, Richard extended his hand. I look forward to working together on this new chapter for Montgomery Vineyards, Ms. Navarro. As do I, Mr. Montgomery, I replied, accepting his handshake. Sometimes the most productive business relationships emerge from unexpected circumstances. Outside, as I prepared to leave, James asked if he could walk me to my car. I owe you an apology, he said once we were alone. Not just for Christmas, but for years of not seeing you clearly. For being too weak to stand up for our marriage, when it mattered. We both contributed to where we ended up, I acknowledged. I spent years making myself smaller to fit into your family's expectations. You shouldn't have had to, he said quietly. The woman who arrived in that private jet, confident, strategic, globally respected, that's who you always were. I just couldn't see past my own limitations to appreciate it. There was genuine regret in his voice, but also something new, a respect that hadn't existed before. What will you do now? He asked, after all this is settled? Continue building Artisan Ventures International, I replied. We're expanding into sustainable luxury goods next quarter, artisanal products with verified ethical sourcing and production methods. And personally? He ventured carefully. I smiled. I've purchased a penthouse in Barcelona, close enough to visit my family's olive grove regularly, but connected to international markets. It suits who I am now. He nodded, understanding that my life had expanded far beyond the confines of Boston society and Montgomery family expectations. The vineyard will honor the new agreement, he assured me. I'll personally oversee the Iowa implementation of the modernization strategy. I believe you will, I said, recognizing the new determination in his manner. Sometimes it takes a shock to the system to catalyze meaningful change. As I drove away from Montgomery Vineyards, I reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past few months. What had begun as a painful rejection at Christmas dinner had transformed into something I couldn't have anticipated. Not just professional vindication, but personal liberation. The woman who had left that Christmas dinner in tears, marriage, shattered and self-worth questioned, had emerged stronger, clearer, and more authentically herself than ever before. I hadn't set out for revenge, despite what the Montgomerys initially believed. I had simply stopped accepting less than I deserved. In business, in relationships, and in how I presented myself to the world. That evening, as my flight climbed, above the clouds returning me to Barcelona, I opened my laptop to find an email from Jennifer Reeves. Attached was a press release draft announcing Montgomery Vineyard's innovative climate adaptation initiative, with James quoted extensively about the importance of honoring tradition while embracing necessary change. The final paragraph mentioned the financial restructuring that had made the initiative possible, crediting international business leader Sofia Navarro as a key strategic partner in the vineyard's future. I smiled as I closed the laptop. The journey hadn't been about proving my worth to the Montgomerys. It had been about finally, fully embracing my own value without apology or diminishment. The private jet that had so shocked them at our meeting wasn't a symbol of revenge. It was a manifestation of the woman I had always been beneath the accommodating exterior. The woman who built international businesses while they worried about Boston's social standings. The woman who saw opportunities where others saw only traditions to be preserved. As we soared over the Atlantic, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for that painful Christmas dinner. Without that moment of clarity, I might have continued compromising my true self indefinitely. Instead, I had emerged whole, powerful, and unapologetically authentic. Sometimes the gifts that transform our lives come wrapped in the most painful packages. The trick is recognizing them for what they truly are, not endings, but doorways to becoming who we were always meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.